the Prince William Sound Science Center. Our partners include the UAF Alaska Sea Grant Extension Office, the Cordova chapter of the Prince William Sound Audubon Society, who hosts one lecture a month, and the Forest Service, who generously donates the space and equipment. Our lecturer for next week is going to be Clay Copeland from CEC, and he's going to be talking about the possibilities for solar energy in Cordova, which is
hard to believe.
Hard to believe, but might be true.
Some days.
Clay seems to generally have some good ideas, so you might know. And the sign-in sheet's going around, so make sure you put your name down on that. And now our speaker for tonight is Jim Bodkin, who's going to be talking about our Nearshore food web and also the Gulf Watch Alaska monitoring program. After spending 30 years studying sea otters and coastal marine ecosystems from Russia to California, Jim retired from the U.S. Geological Survey in 2012, where he led a nearshore research program. He continues to pursue his interests in nearshore marine ecology as a scientist emeritus and consultant. He's been engaged with studies of the effects of the Exxon Valdez oil spill on nearshore species, primarily sea otters, since March 1989, so pretty much got right in there, and helped develop the nearshore component of the Gulf Watch Alaska monitoring program. So, welcome, Jim.
I'm not sure who's missed this. And did you sign in? No. Okay.
Well, so thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. And I also like to recognize the Prince William Sound Science Center, who facilitated my travel here tonight. So I'm not sure, do we have a way
Clicker?
for me to,
Yep.
to move? And does it also have a pointer available?
There is a pointer in there.
Oh yeah.
Hang on, those thumb drives in here.
Okay, great. And so I was brought here to talk about the Gulf Watch Alaska program, and I will do that. But I'm going to start by I'm going to ask you to think about nearshore or about marine ecosystems in perhaps a little bit different way than you might, or about oceans in a little bit different way than you might typically think about the ocean. And so early in my career, 1975, I read a book. It was called Perception and Performance Underwater. And it was mainly about the psychology of working underwater. But one of the points of the book was that when you go underwater, you go from an atmospheric environment where we essentially have unlimited depth of field, if you will. Our vision extends far off into space. As identified here, could we turn the lights down?
Do you want all of them off, or do you want?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Okay. Whatever. But when you go underwater, your depth of field is limited to a few meters, maybe a few tens of meters under kind of rare circumstances, and as a result, we view the oceans inherently different than we view kind of the terrestrial systems on our planet. And so with that as a bit of a background, I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways to view the ocean. After I can figure out which of these buttons is going to move me.
They're on the left.
Okay. I need some lights.
Plus it's like one or two for almost everybody, so this is the page up and down,
Okay.
and just see the
Okay.
switch.
Okay, great. So ocean perspectives. I have to turn off this part over here before
Try
I
just
can
advancing the
use
slide
that.
and see if
There we go. Okay. So another kind of way to view the oceans, and this is just another example of kind of the inherent limitations of viewing the oceans. Satellite image, in which, in the case of the continents, we're quite capable of seeing, landforms. We can see elevations. We can see even vegetative communities. We can see watersheds and a variety of different aspects of the physical environment. And in fact, if we zoomed in on this satellite, we might even be able to detect, individual species of organisms. So we have tremendous resolution in viewing kind of systems, ecosystems, if you will, that occur in the atmosphere that we really don't have when it comes to viewing ocean systems, as you can tell, because you can't see anything here except blue. And that's kind of our vision, at least historically, of oceans. And I'll get this right eventually. One of the early looks, this is an image of the first map that was made of the globe, in which they essentially took the oceans away. So now we have a view of at least what the structure of the oceans look like in the absence of the water. And just as a note, a woman who was the creator of this original map in, I think, in 1959, has recently passed away. So I also wanted to recognize.
I remember that being more like around 1970, because I got a copy of that when it came out, National Geographic.
Maybe it was 59 when she started working on it.
Yeah.
It took a long time.
Because the mid-ocean ridge hypothesis for ocean spread
Right,
that
came
was
out of
developed in the 60s. Most of the oceanographic
Yeah.
data came out then.
But taking the water away does allow us to look at the oceans, at least the kind of the physical features of the oceans, in a more explicit way. And you can see things like the continental ridges and the margins and the continental slopes and all of the features that that we're probably familiar with, as well as some of the underlying geology, subduction zones and whatnot that form parts of the ocean as we can visualize it. If we look into kind of more recent times and we kind of invoke some more recent technologies, we can actually look at things on the surface of the ocean that are other than a single kind of opaque perspective. And this is just one example of ocean surface salinity. I'll show some a little bit later that include things like chlorophyll, so that we can look at, again, some of the biological and physical features of the ocean. But again, realize that we're really just looking at the surface on these. When we want to go into the oceans, we lose that perspective that we have in the atmosphere.
It's pretty good that it shows the North Pacific being much less saline than most of the rest of the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And the high salinity in the Atlantic.
And the Mediterranean especially.
Yeah, ocean features. But again, just not to get into too much of the oceanography or the particular aspects, but just thinking about ways to visualize and the limitations that we have in visualizing oceans. In this case, we're looking at primary productivity, and I'm not exactly sure how this was calculated. I assume it was probably also from satellite imagery and probably also from chlorophyll data. But regardless, the point being that we're starting, with things like this, we can look at kind of primary productivity in the oceans at a very crude scale, and again, primarily in that surface layer. But again, pointing out in this case, at least, that the regions of the highest productivity are mostly around these nearshore regions.
Upwelling areas especially.
Pardon?
Upwelling areas.
Upwelling areas, right. And also probably that you're looking at transport across oceans, generated by winds and current systems of primary production that's being moved. You can see this in the southern hemisphere in particular. Another way to look at the oceans, and again, so we're in that last sense, we were looking at kind of the physical aspects of the oceans at a global scale. And maybe a little bit of the biology, again, at a global scale. But we can also look at the oceans through individual species. And individual species can tell us a lot about the ocean and the environment. And I'm just going to put a few of these slides forward because they're stunning images, and I borrowed them from the photographers that took them. And I want to give them all recognition, and I don't know who they are. But they're just remarkable images. And the point being that we can view these images, or we can view these oceans through individual species as kind of an alternative to that more holistic view of oceans based on things like satellite imagery. So we can look at birds, and we can look at mammals, we can look at fishes, and these are all valid ways to look at the oceans. And they're kind of offering different perspectives. So the next step here is to kind of combine the physical features of the ocean at some spatial scale that's smaller than the globe. And here we have, a nearshore habitat. This is a coral reef system and fairly easy to see the physical features of it. And then when we look closely, we can see that there's a community of organisms that reside in this. And so we can start to think about, specific habitats and the communities of organisms that reside in those habitats. And again, in the context of, if we could see hundreds of miles under the ocean, can you imagine what the oceans would look like? It's hard, but it would, it wouldn't look like this. This is a very small, specific habitat with very high density, and it's a nearshore habitat. So we have oceans, and we have individual organisms, we have communities of organisms, and we have the physical and biological features. And then we also have ecological processes, and there's lots of these that interact with communities to form the systems, the marine systems that we're going to talk about in the Gulf Watch program. Competition is just one of these processes, and this happens to be competition between males for reproductive access. There's also spatial competition, and this is an example of both competition for space in the intertidal zones as well as predation. The sea stars here consuming the mussels. And another way to look at predation, and the role that predation plays in marine communities. And again, just a stunning image. And so the point I wanted to get to was food webs. And so food webs are really based on the structure of the community, the primary producers in the community, and then who's eating who in the community. And this is simply an example of that. And so with the exception of one of these slides, all of these slides were kind of different ways to view the marine system, and they were all, with the exception of one of those, in areas outside of the Gulf of Alaska, outside of Prince William Sound. So with that, I'm going to introduce the Gulf Watch Alaska program. All right, and so this is a program that's designed essentially to monitor the pulse of the changing ecosystems in the Gulf of Alaska. And I'm going to describe briefly the organization and the structure of this program. And I'm mainly going to recognize, here's all of the contributors to the program and the leadership, the folks that are providing the leadership. And I'll recognize Katrina Hoffman, the Prince William Sound Science Center, because of where I am tonight. And the rest of them, I'm not going to name all these folks or these organizations, but they're all instrumental in this program that I'll briefly describe. So there's essentially 4 monitoring components into this program. There's the environmental drivers, basically the biological and the physical oceanography. There's the nearshore component that I'm going to talk about in detail. There's a pelagic component that I'll describe generally, but more in a conceptual way as opposed to a specific way. And then there's a lingering oil component, designed essentially to look at the oil remaining from the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The locations where the program takes place, basically in the Gulf of Alaska, Prince William Sound in particular, and Ketchimek Bay and Cook Inlet. I am going to talk a little bit about the synthesis with current and historical data, but it's only going to be in a couple of examples based on nearshore information. And this program is kind of evolving, and with the herring research and monitoring program that probably most of you are familiar with, but I'm not going to speak at all about. But I will talk a little bit about how the work is being conducted with the efforts of other state and federal agencies, as well as the University of Alaska and some private consulting firms. So from now on, it's pretty much just going to be about the nearshore component of the Gulf Watch Alaska program and the personnel. Many of these folks you guys are probably familiar with, and I'll identify the institutions: the USGS Alaska Science Center, the National Park Service, which essentially had adopted this nearshore monitoring program before the Exxon Valdez Trustee Council adopted it. Even though we designed it for the Trustee Council, the National Park Service adopted it and implemented it a couple of years before Gulf Watch Alaska was formed. There's Coastal Resource Associates and Ock Bay Lab, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the University of Alaska and the Ketchikan Bay Research Reserve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to define the nearshore ecosystem in the Gulf of Alaska that we're going to be monitoring. I'm going to just try to describe how it contrasts and complements the pelagic system and the influence with the ocean primarily in terms of the environmental drivers, the physical and biological oceanography. That's how it might be affecting the near shore. So we're going to go back and think again about the oceans and our perspectives and our perceptions of the ocean. And we're going to add in the continents, okay? And if we look at the margin of these two of the or you could view this as the two dominant or the two only the two features of our planet, the oceans and the continents. There's a narrow band of habitat that bridges these two features, and that's this nearshore zone that we're going to talk about. And obviously, this is not to scale. This band of nearshore is a very small, in most places, very narrow band. It could largely be considered almost just two-dimensional in its relation, but it's influenced by both the oceans on one side and the continents on the other. And it's easy to see from the continents that gravity is taking place here and moving sediments and water and fresh water down into this nearshore zone and out into the ocean, and influencing the nearshore in that regard. And there's matter and energy that's moving from the oceans into this nearshore zone. So it's not an isolated. Clearly, these are fluid environments, and there's exchange, and those are important aspects of this system, and ones that we're not going to dwell very much on, but recognizing that they are important. And there's important interactions going in the other direction. The nearshore feeds energy back up into the watersheds in a variety of different ways, almost all biological. Organisms in the nearshore, they're feeding there, are moving things up into the nearshore. And there's interactions with the oceans in terms of largely propagules from organisms that reside in the nearshore. Many of them have planktonic stages that spend a great deal of time and often end up out in the ocean realm. So I'm going to kind of contrast these two in a little bit more detail here. And I'm going to focus initially on the distinctions between the two. So, and recognizing I'm going to talk about a food web in the pelagic zone, and there's certainly many, many food webs in the pelagic zone, as well as in the deep benthos, and I'm not going to talk about those. But in general, the food web I'm going to talk about in the pelagic zone, and the one that's of interest in the Gulf Watch program, is one where nearly all of the primary production comes from phytoplankton. And the energy that's converted by the phytoplankton is transmitted up the food web by zooplankton and fish pathways to the apex consumers, which will be things like the birds and the mammals and some of the other fishes and some of the invertebrates as well. In general, it's a nutrient-limited system. There's not a lot of nutrients in the ocean, and oftentimes those nutrients are coming from land. Some of them are coming from deeper in the ocean, and it requires movement of those nutrients up into the system. The system is diffuse, and by diffuse I mean it's a huge system. 70% of the globe is covered by this ocean, but the plankton in the ocean, the concentrations of it are fairly diffuse and ephemeral. In other words, that there's some seasonal components to those, and it's not a highly predictable system. Most of the species that occur here are highly mobile. Some of them move across entire ocean basins. Things like some of the seabirds and the whales, and some of the fishes that make transoceanic migrations.
Up and
of course,
down as well.
pardon me? Vertical as well. Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. and as exemplified by the depths that this system occurs in. So, but on the other hand, in this nearshore, this is a system where much of the primary productivity is derived from the kelps and the seagrasses that occur here that are fixed in the substrate. And in this system, it's benthic invertebrates, things like clams and crabs and mussels and urchins that are transmitting the energy, again, from the primary producers up to the apex consumers, things like, again, some of the other sea ducks, seabirds, including things like sea ducks, things like some of the fishes in the system, and things like sea otters in particular. Walrus would be another example of a marine mammal. So in contrast to this pelagic system, space is limited here. Space is the defining feature. Substrate is the defining feature of the habitat. Nearly everything that occurs in that food web is attached to the bottom in one way or another through some or all of its life stages. So substrate is critical in this. Most of the species are sedentary. The sea otter, as an example, has a home range, an annual home range that can be from less than 1 to maybe several tens of square kilometers. Things like mussels even have smaller home ranges. They're pretty much sedentary for most of their adult life, although they're capable of moving. But anyway, most of these animals, most of the characters in this food web are relatively sedentary when we think of, in comparison to the pelagic web. As I said, substrates are important, and depth is limited probably by the ability of light to penetrate into the sea in the nearshore zone, which is, on the order of 20, 30, 40, 50 meters. Generally, it doesn't get much beyond that. So as a result, we have two functionally distinct, yet in complementary ways, two different food webs here. And in complementary, and I'll get to that down the road, how their contrast can lead to improved inferences about changes in the system. This pelagic food web, a fairly simple cartoon here with the phytoplankton here feeding the zooplankton, and even in this they have urchin larvae, fish larvae, crabzoe, organisms that are coming from the nearshore zone, which isn't here, but feeding this forage fish community, which is eventually consumed by these apex predators. And again, supporting commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, subsistence fisheries, an important aspect because this really has driven a lot of our understanding and interest in the marine systems. Are the commercial interests and the extraction of those for human benefit. In contrast, the nearshore, these again, some of the kelps, the algae, the seagrass isn't pictured here, but certainly it is a major player, is a primary producer in the system. We have the secondary consumers, things like snails and limpets and mussels, chitons, sea stars here, which actually could be in both of these places because they're a secondary or tertiary consumer here, but are also consumed by the sea otter here, but also our predators themselves. And just a couple of examples of the apex predators, the black oyster catcher and the sea otter. We might also add many of the sea ducks that are kind of apex predators and probably influential in as consumers in this nearshore food web. So I've said that in this food web, much of the primary production comes from kelps, and this is a question that or a statement that we've only recently been able to make, although there has been quite a bit of work done identifying the role of kelps in the food web. But I'm going to show you some data that describes exactly how much of the carbon in some of the species is derived from these kelps. Right? But you might ask, how does this kelp feed this food web? And there's a couple of ways. And one of them is by grazers at this level here, animals that are actually grazing on these living kelp plants. and that are then consumed by other species. But probably more importantly is this source. So many of these plants are annuals. These happen to be this is a perennial here. And I'll use that term plants, and I know that many of you will take exception to that, but just for general terms here, they're not plants, algae rather. But in the context of photosynthesis, they function as such. So, but this is where a lot of this primary productivity ends up on an annual basis, and it ends up there in the fall as the winter storm seasons begin, and it essentially rips these kelps out, deposits them on the store where they begin the process of becoming degraded, and the carbon in this system then becomes available. It washes back out into the sea and feeds this nearshore food web, as well as the offshore food web. So the question that we've been asking is, what's the relative contribution of the kelp as compared to the phytoplankton? And I'm going to show you a couple of slides, some fairly recent data. This is the work of one of the PIs in a different project, but is taking advantage of the Gulf Watch program. And this is a doctoral, she just finished, Vanessa Von Vila with the USGS. This was part of her dissertation. So what we have here, I'm going to show a couple of slides, so I'll take a little time to describe it. But these bars, the black bars, represent the proportion of carbon in the muscle of the mussel that's coming from the kelps, the macroalgae, and the blue bars represent the proportion of carbon in the muscle of the mussel that's coming from the microalgae or the plankton. And you might recognize some of these sites here in western Prince William Sound. These are Kenai fjords, and this is Katmai. And these are using stable isotopes of carbon, is how the techniques that were used to generate these data, as well as the next couple of slides. And what we can see here is that 60 to 70, upwards of over 80% or nearly 80% of the carbon in the mussel is coming from the kelps, as opposed to 20, 30, 40, upwards of 50% in one place. In fact, I think there's only one site where the contribution of carbon from microalgae exceeds that of the macroalgae, and that's at Harris Laguna and Kenai fjords. So this tells us essentially, how important kelps are to the mussels anyway in the system. And you might say, well, mussels live in the intertidal zone predominantly, and that's where the kelps are washing ashore. Maybe this isn't too surprising, and I would agree, it's not too surprising, but it just kind of quantifies the contribution of the kelp. So we're going to look now at a couple of other species, two fish that maybe some of you are familiar with. The black rockfish, which is generally considered to be somewhat of a predator in the forage fish, or the maybe even the zooplankton food web, but primarily consuming things that are coming from the ocean. The kelp greenling being a benthic species that occurs in the near shore and consumes things like primarily crustaceans. And again, we're going to ask the same question about the relative contribution in the mussel of these two species that's coming from kelps versus the microalgae. So a little bit different slide. The same axis here, the proportion of kelp derived from the carbon. And these are the sites that we've collected the samples, and this is from California, Washington, British Columbia, and then a couple of sites. Again, these are Gulf Watch Alaska sites, the western Prince William Sound and Katmai. And this is the kelp greenling. And what we see is in the Gulf of Alaska, that nearly all of the carbon in this fish is coming from the kelps. Don't worry too much about the blue and the red. The difference between each of them is just based on an assumption in the calculation. So these are kind of a range of values, but so you could say that for the northern Gulf of Alaska, Katmai, from 90 to nearly 100% of the carbon is coming from the kelps, and you can say that for the different regions. So now again, not too surprising, a forage or a fish that
Is that Washington data all from the coast, or does that include Puget Sound?
no, it's all from the outer coast.
Okay.
So now we're going to look at the black rockfish, and this was a little bit surprising. These fish were all collected in nearshore reef systems. They were collected in depths, out to about 60 to 80 feet over reefs, not necessarily very near shore, but over reef systems in fairly shallow water. And again, we see that depending on the assumption that 60 to 80% of the carbon in the muscle of the black rockfish is also coming from the kelps. So these slides were designed to convince you of the importance of kelps in this food web, and I hope it's done that. So I'm going to leave that at this point and talk a little bit more about how this nearshore food web is not isolated, how it interacts with other components in the marine system, how the kelp in this system might be influenced or consumed in indirect ways by organisms that you wouldn't think of as being nearshore. Yes?
We've seen sea otters eating kelp. Is this common?
They probably weren't eating kelp. They don't eat kelp. But what they do eat are epiphytes, animals that live on kelp. And it was probably little mussels, and it was probably musculus. And they're very small, and you almost can't see them, but it looks like they're eating kelp. And they might ingest some kelp in the process, but it's probably these epiphytes that they're
Do
consuming.
they eat sea urchins at all?
I'll get to that. And yes, the answer is yes.
And sea urchins eat kelp.
Sea urchins eat the kelp, yes. And we'll talk about that in some detail. But, so there's members of the terrestrial community that make their way down into the intertidal. I'm sure you're all aware of these. Deer are another one that's commonly found in here. And they're actually consuming organisms that are feeding in this decomposing kelp at times. We have animals, things like seabirds and sea mammals, some of the sea lions and pinnipeds are transporting energy from the oceans back into this nearshore zone. I talked a little bit about fisheries, but I guess the point I wanted to make here was that there are linkages across these systems. And there are important linkages, and they're ones that kind of bind the pelagic and the nearshore component of the Gulf Watch programs. So it's important to keep them in mind. So there's attributes of the nearshore that are important. They're important to us as scientists in being able to understand this system and this food web. And they're in contrast to the pelagic system or the offshore systems that are inherently more difficult for a variety of reasons, which will kind of be apparent as I talk about what these attributes are in the nearshore. So at first, it's observable. And I mean that in a couple of ways, in that you can observe it from the shore. You can observe it with the naked eye. You can observe it with binoculars and high-powered telescopes. We're actually able to watch animals that occur in this nearshore food web that bring their prey to the surface. We can see what they're eating. We can watch what they're eating. We can quantify what they're eating and how much energy they're bringing back from their foraging efforts. And we can also go into this system. We can set up permanent transects. We can set up permanent study sites. We can go into the system either by holding our breath in shallow water or by using scuba technologies. And great advancements have been made in marine science because of the observability and the manipulability of this system. You can go down and you can remove kelp forests, and you can see what the effects of removing kelp forests are. Or you can exclude animals from the kelp forest, and you can see what the effects are. So there's some really great advantages in the nearshore that support science and our understanding. Because of these attributes, it allows us a very rigorous sampling design, and it allows us to make statistical inference. And you might say, well, who cares about that? but it becomes really important when you have something like an Exxon Valdez oil spill or a Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or when you have any kind of catastrophe where the legal community wants to get involved, or because you have to have kind of legally, statistically defensible measures, and it's absolutely essential to have those. Otherwise, you're left essentially saying, well, we don't know. So these same attributes allow us to make accurate and precise population estimates. And again, this is that statistically and legally defensible measures of trends and change over time. It's a relatively well understood system because of the background, the history of work that's been done in the system. Then allow us to assign cause to change in the system that we can observe if we understand the processes that are underlying the change. And again, this contrasts to the pelagic but system in that a lot of these attributes are more difficult to obtain in the pelagic zone. And it's linked to the environmental drivers, both of these systems. All right, so I'm going to take a brief break here, and we're going to take a drive by the nearshore. And this is essentially to allow those of you who haven't been underwater to look at the nearshore to get a vision of two things. One of them is your limited visibility, and that will be obvious. And the other one is the extent to which these plants, these algae, are kind of contributing and covering the substrate in the system. So I'll see, I'm not sure if I have to, maybe I have to.
Is that video?
Yeah, I think you can just
I can do it from your
hit
computer.
a button. Yeah, there you go. Now, so there's a couple of divers here, and you're going to see why they're in the water and what they're doing and what this equipment is. But really what I want you to look at is the bottom. This is seagrass that you're coming by. These are some brown algae that you're going here. And basically you don't see any substrate. It's completely covered by these primary producers in this system. You're going to see, I think there's a school of small herring coming up here.
This was shot in Prince William Sound?
Yeah, this was in Prince William Sound. This was out by Danger Island. Here's some of the canopy-forming kelps that aren't yet in the canopy-forming stage. This is Nearshore, or the bull kelp, and you can kind of see the biomass, if you will, of these primary producers in this system. And as you can see here, we can see maybe 20 feet, 5 or 7 meters in here. And so this was why this video was taken, basically this is how we capture sea otters, but that wasn't why I showed it, but I didn't have anything without the sea otter capture in it, so we have to watch it. And the last part of it, so there's two moms and their pups up here, and each diver will put one of those mom-pup pairs in their trap, and they're going to pull a purse string that'll close that trap, and then the tending boat will come by and pick them up, and we'll process these animals and release them. But I just wanted to give you kind of a view of what this nearshore system looked like, kind of from the underwater view. Okay. So, Tom asked about sea otters like urchins. They eat them. So I'll tell a little story. Some 25, 50, 30 years ago now, we moved a group of sea otters, 142 of them, from the mainland of California, the Big Sur coast, out to an island offshore, San Nicolas Island, where sea otters had been absent for probably over 100 years. And during that time, the invertebrate population in the nearshore had grown, and there were large populations of urchins and crabs, things like abalone, lobsters, a wide suite of potential prey for the sea otters. And so we took these animals out there, we released them, and 90% of their diet was urchins. That's what they ate. So given a wide range of abundant and valuable nutritiously valuable prey items, the otters preferred the urchins. So here's just a kind of a few photographs of a small sampling of the 150 species that we know that sea otters consume. Almost all of them are, these benthic invertebrates. They rarely will eat fish, very rarely. I've watched probably tens of thousands of otters feed, and I've seen 3 occasions where fish were being consumed. And 2 of those were sand lance here in Prince William Sound.
In Cordova Harbor, you'll see sea otters eating the remains of fish without fillets on them.
Yeah, and that,
Pretty common.
yeah. But I wouldn't consider that predation. That's an
Scavenging.
opportunity. Yeah, they're scavenging it. So anyway, just a sampling of the prey items that otters will consume. But with the recognition that their preferred prey is this one in the middle, the urchins, a variety of different species, including green and purple and red urchins. They don't eat divers, though. I need to clarify that. But because sea otters were hunted to near extinction, we had a tremendous opportunity to look at nearshore systems in the absence of sea otters. And we had this opportunity in the Aleutians and in Russia and in Alaska, throughout Alaska, Washington, British Columbia, and California. And everywhere we've looked, we've seen the same pattern. Where otters are absent, urchins are a dominant species in the system, and they tend to overgraze the system. So these are all green urchins. You can see large green urchins at very high density, and relatively few algae in the system. There's a few here that are able to persist because they occur on the tops of these rocks that offer a form of refuge. But this is what the system looks like in the absence of sea otters. So sea otters come in, and they're quite happy about this situation, and they'll take as many of these urchins as they possibly can, and it doesn't take very long for them to essentially remove all of the large urchins. In places where otters occur, urchins are extremely rare. They do occur, obviously, they're still persistent, but they're essentially rare, and they occur in some very specific habitats. But this is what the system looks like in the presence of otters and the absence of urchins. So these urchins have a tremendous adverse effect on the kelps, and of course these kelps provide not only primary productivity, but they provide structure in this environment that essentially is structureless. In other words, these kelps are providing habitat for a large number of invertebrates, fishes, birds, and mammals as well. So the system becomes much more diverse and much more productive in terms of the amount of biomass in the system. And I will go away again, sorry. So what does this mean in terms of our ability to, I said it's an observable system. So what we have here is the results of being able to observe sea otters foraging. And these blue bars, or these blue symbols, represent basically the energy intake rate. And this is in kilocalories per minute. This can be converted into hours of day spent foraging. And in this case, these numbers represent about 6 to 8 hours per day of feeding. And these are all areas where sea otter populations are recovering, where food is abundant. It's so there's, they haven't been here for a while. We moved them in, or they moved into new areas where they hadn't occurred, and we see real high rates of energy recovery by watching these animals feed, by timing how long it takes them to get their prey, how long it takes them to consume that prey, and then the caloric content of the prey that they're obtaining. And these yellow symbols represent areas where sea otters have been present for long periods of time. Here's western Prince William Sound, where they're getting half to a third of what they're getting in these other populations. So
It's the lowest point, too.
yeah, it is. It's actually a little bit higher right now, and we make some inferences about what that means. But this is kind of the range of energy recovery rates from sea otters that are feeding in areas where they're considered to be at or near carrying capacity with their food resources.
So
Is that
I was gonna say, do you think eastern Prince William Sound, Orca Inlet, where it's so dense, would be like that western Prince William Sound, pretty well?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to speculate. They've been there for a while now.
They got here in '78, I want to say.
Yeah, I would suspect that it's not at this level, but I don't know. I really don't. You have to go out and watch.
Does the energy intake also reflect on the number of juveniles that the otters produce? You get fewer juveniles if they're energy limited?
No, you know what it reflects. These are mustelids, and they respond to reduced energy intakes through survival of the offspring as opposed to the production of the offspring.
You have a lot more deaths now.
Right. Yeah, right. And I think that's what I was going to get with the next part.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Tom. So, when you have this kind of energy available, you end up looking like this fella. And if you have this kind of energy, you're more likely to end up like this fella. So,
You think that's part of the problem, though, with the recovery of otters from the oil spill, is that situation?
no, actually, Tom, we actually, if we looked back, if we looked at, and this is, let's see, this rate here from Western Prince William Sound was, let's see, 2012 to 2015. And we did collect this same data in the 1990s, and the value was up here around 8.5 or 9. Okay, so it was higher. And that we used that data to conclude that it wasn't food that was limiting recovery of sea otters in Western Prince William Sound, and which led us to further investigate the potential that oil was. So, okay, the vital signs. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail here about the vital signs, and this is generated from the National Parks nationwide vital signs program, which was how they organized the sampling in the Nearshore. And I just, we don't necessarily follow the same vital signs, but it's a good way to organize basically the data collection that we do in the Gulf Watch Alaska Nearshore program. And it's these 6 vital signs here, and I'm going to go through a little bit of each one of them and tell you what we're doing for those. So there's marine water chemistry, and essentially it's temperature and salinity on an annual basis, actually a continual basis for temperature and salinity as we can get these instruments to function, and contaminants on an irregular basis, 8 to 10 year intervals. With a focus on a few invertebrates for the contaminants.
You know, marine chemists would tell you that those two things are actually part of physical oceanography and not chemical oceanography.
Yeah.
They do temperature and salinity for physical oceanography.
Right.
Things like nitrate, phosphate, silicate, things like that
For chemistry. The kelps and seagrasses, we have a specific monitoring protocol for the seagrasses. We're looking at basically abundance and distribution in existing beds that we monitor over time. And the kelps are looked at primarily in the intertidal zone, but with some work in the subtidal, looking essentially at species composition. In the intertidal algae, we're looking at species composition, percent cover, and distribution. And I'm going to show you at the end kind of the sampling design. But we have, in the intertidal invertebrates, we're sampling in 3 different habitats. We're sampling the rocky substrates, soft sediment habitats, and we also have dedicated mussel beds. So we're sampling, again, the species composition, abundance, and density. We're actually measuring sizes and growth of individuals of some species, and we're focusing on these 3 species here, the mussels, clams, and limpets, because we know that they're important to the sea otters and the sea ducks and the oyster catchers.
Are you guys doing Mearns Rock still?
Yeah, it's still being done. And we take the photos and send them down. We don't do much else with them. We also do surveys of marine birds and mammals, and here we're starting to get into species that are both occupants of this nearshore food web that I described, as well as members of this forage fish food web. including things like seals and sea lions and some of the other seabirds. But we're measuring the distribution, the density, and the trends in abundance over both the winter and summer, because there's very different assemblages of birds in the marine environments, in the nearshore marine environments, depending on the
What's
the
going
season.
on there in the lower right in with that?
Oh. Well, we have a predator in the system. We have two predators actually. I guess in this case, one of them is a prey, the sea lion here, and there's a
jump in.
predator here. And I think there was also sea otters in this image originally as well. So sea otters are one of the two focal species of the apex consumers in the systems, and so we spend a bit. I have a concentrated effort here looking at sea otter specific surveys to estimate abundance and distribution. We conduct surveys to look at mortality, basically through the age composition of dying animals. We spend quite a bit of time looking at diet, which we can observe directly, and we can calculate those energy intake rates, which we can then convert to time budgets. And, oh, that was the wrong button. I'm going to need help now. Think it'll go away?
Can you get down to exit there at the bottom, using the arrows?
These arrows.
Circle arrows, yeah.
Okay, thanks. That was good. Oh,
Oops, almost.
thanks. Black oyster catchers are the other primary or apex level consumer in the system, and that we're measuring the density, abundance of, in terms of both adults and their nesting density. We're looking at nest occupancy and productivity in terms of the number of eggs and the chicks that are produced. And we also look at diet, primarily through the prey that are brought from the adults back to the nest for the chicks.
A lot of limpets, huh?
Yeah, it depends on the nest, but they do eat a lot of limpets. Limpets and mussels probably make up 80% of the average oyster catcher chick diet, and then kites are also can probably come in third place. Okay, so this is the spatial design, and I need to say again that within each of these blocks, all of the sites are randomly selected based on a stratified random sampling design, which allows us to make inference within each of these blocks. The red blocks are the intensive sampling blocks that are sampled at least once a year. And this Ketchikan Bay site is sampled by the University of Alaska, and that's also done on an annual basis. The Eastern Sound and the Northern Sound are extensive sampling blocks that get sampled less frequently, once every 3 years. And a subset of all of the metrics are sampled in those sites. Okay, design features for understanding cause of change, because one of the fundamental assumption that we make in this program is that change is going to occur. And it's an important assumption because it allows us to not necessarily assign cause to the change, but it allows us to test competing hypotheses about what caused the change. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that. But we can use these spatial and temporal patterns. So, for example, if we see a change up here, this is our observation island site. If we saw a change here but nowhere else in the Gulf of Alaska, we might infer that it's a relatively small scale change that caused by some of you guys here in Cordova. But on the alternatively, if we see that same change over this entire scale, or just maybe at the Kenai Peninsula, you would draw some different inferences about what the mechanisms might be behind that. We can use time in the same way that we use space here to ask the question of, are these changes occurring from here in any kind of temporal pattern across the Gulf? Or is there some temporal pattern at any one of these sites? We can look at trophic relations. Again, who's eating who in this system, and can that explain the changes that we're seeing in the populations? Productivity and growth. Essentially, is it a bottom-up feature or mechanism in the system that's resulting in the change that we're seeing in these consumer populations. And that you can use size and age structure in that same vein. So these are kind of design features that we built in explicitly to answer the question or to inform the questions of what caused the change that we observed, because we're expecting change. Okay, so here's an example of understanding cause, and this is using real-time data, stuff that we're collecting now, and that we just answered this question, why, a few weeks ago. So we have this sea otter populations at Katmai, recolonized that area in the 1960s, had a relatively rapid growth up through 2012, maybe 2008. This could be within the sampling errors of the population estimates, but clearly a high rate of growth and at least a leveling off in this period here. And the question is why? What information do we have that can inform us about what's causing this decline? And I want to point out that this is actually part of the Southwest Alaska stock that's listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. So management has an interest in this question of why is this decline? Is the decline that we see on the Alaska Peninsula and in the Aleutian Islands extending to the east? Or is there some other mechanism at play here? So we're going to go back to this plot. You've seen this before. And I'll point out Katmai. And this was data that was collected in 2008. And at that time, we saw that otters were basically getting 12 kilocalories per minute. That translates into, they're only having to spend about 8 hours a day feeding. So at least in 2008, which I'll go back briefly, is this point here, which was population, it was still apparently growing at that time. Okay, Katmai 2009, now we're going to look at Katmai 2014, and their energy recovery rate now is down here. It is just under 6 kilocalories per minute, and this is basically, they're living on the edge of their capacity to intake energy to sustain growth. They're feeding at about 12 to 13 hours a day when they're getting this type of calories. So, we basically infer then from this that it's more likely that the population has attained, or approaching some carrying capacity with food resources, and it's not some other predation factor that might have been influencing the population, and it's probably unrelated to the decline in the Aleutians. Okay.
Excuse me, a couple of questions.
Okay.
Do you have the otter population density in per unit area as well as per unit energy available? Have you been able to compare otters in that respect and see if there's a trend? In other words, they get to a certain energy level, but instead of doing it per minute, can you do it for the population? Here's the number of otters per so much energy, and do that kind of like an energy density, aerial energy density.
Yeah, we could. What that does is it brings in another unknown variable, and that is prey density.
So you don't actually know that.
We don't know that. But we could do that. We could calculate it on a on an otter density basis. Okay. So I tried to describe here our Nearshore long-term monitoring program. I didn't put it explicitly in the context of the pelagic component. I tried to allude to it, and again the ocean drivers and physical and biological components. I put these in here so that you recognize that I described one of the components of the Gulf Watch program, and these other two components will provide for a greater understanding of the system in its entirety, as opposed to simply to this nearshore monitoring program. And I'm going to wrap it up with that. So thank you so much for your interest and your attention. And I'll be happy to discuss anything. but it was,
No, just the kelp, where everything was being driven by kelp. You know, what about eelgrass?
so, yeah,
Well, there's not so much detritus from the eelgrass as there compared to the kelp.
well, so we did consider that, and at least for the forage, the two fish that we sampled, I showed you the data, those were all collected, off of rocky shorelines that didn't have eelgrass beds. And I can't say that for the mussel samples because, those beds, there could have been some mussels, and eelgrass was put into the mixing models that were used to generate those values.
Isotopically,
It's-
eelgrass looks a lot like kelp, so you can't really separate them. But I
Right,
don't think
right.
eelgrass produces anywhere as much detritus.
No,
Everyone here you can smell it, you decomposing
yeah, right.
algae on the beach.
Right.
It's pretty obvious.
But it does add complication. As could other sources of carbon in the system from watersheds. Yeah, but, so I would only use those values as kind of a rough guideline about, the relative magnitude of carbon, where it's coming from, and the kelps, the importance of the kelps, at least to those species. I'm convinced.
It might also explain, like in Washington, where you got the Washington coast, you got those different values, and it's probably because
Yeah.
of the amount of kelp available there.
Yeah. What I'd like to see us do is take this approach with more of the pelagic species. I'd like to see us do this with some of the herring, with some of the maybe the juvenile age classes of herring that might be spending more time in this nearshore, and see if they have a signature. Is herring, or are the kelps important to herring?
It turns out I've done isotope work on the herring, and among the forage fish, it had the most oceanic signature. They did that paper they did about 20 years ago, and compared different forage fish species, kelp, the herring was the most pelagic. So they're probably eating mostly plankton, zooplankton that are not able to benefit that much from the kelp.
Right.
But some of the herring that were sampled in Simpson Bay had a somewhat different value, more consistent with eating the coastal carbon source,
Yeah.
which is enriched in carbon-13, so it's pretty.
So what
Pretty
about
obvious.
did you look at the age 0 or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was almost all juvenile.
Oh, it was all the same?
Yeah. But there's a difference. In Simpson Bay has, there's a late spawning group of herring there that spawn in June, and so we've got a lot of little herring during the summertime. A few in the other places, but quite a few in Simpson Bay, so there's like a bimodal distribution in the isotopes as well as their size.
How exactly do you get the carbon from test the carbon?
Oh, we took it directly from the tissues of the fishes, or from the mussels, and so it was mussel tissue that we took, and then it went to a laboratory in I think it's in New Mexico now, Seth Newsom's lab.
How long does the signature stay consistent? I mean, if it's a fish, can you tell how long it's?
Yeah, Tom would probably give you a better answer than I would, but the answer that I get when I ask that question from our stable isotope guys is that it's probably on the order of months.
Yeah, it depends on the fish size. The real small fish are turning over the material really fast. So I've measured juvenile salmon, and you can actually do a plot as a function of length, because they start out with a mother signature, because they have the egg yolk, and then you can see it change.
So has anybody looked at the salmon, at the king salmon in the Gulf of Alaska, or the different species of salmon?
I've done some work on salmon, all adult salmon, except for the pink salmon. I've done a lot of juvenile pink salmon work.
Do they show much of a kelp signature?
It's a pelagic signature.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of variability, and I found actually quite a bit of variability in Prince William Sound, and it was correlated to marine survival rates. So I did a paper on that. You probably saw it. So there's oceanic subsidies coming into the sound, and that seemed to affect the pink salmon marine survival rate. But I was not able to show anything with herring. That was kind of one of the goals. But, so that's, Ted Cooney's River Lake hypothesis.
Yeah.
So,
Jim was
Yeah.
really real interesting to hear how well it was shown how important an intact ecosystem is. Maybe a lot of people don't care for all these otters coming back, and yet if we don't have them, now some people are very upset about all the extra humpback whales because they're eating hatchery fish and things. And yet I'm curious, have you seen some of these stories and articles about what the humpback whales are bringing back to us in they're just this incredible composting machine that mixes the water. And there was just recently a story on that not only kicking off krill and then in turn other fish, the whole system is improving because of the larger whale numbers, but it's actually being taken up into the upland. I can't remember what site it was on just recently, but showing that humpback whale influence and their nitrogen fixing abilities in their poop is making it up into the upland and is going to improve that as well. But that was really I thought really good to show that.
Yeah, that systems are
importance of a system, intact system, everything is there for a reason.
I think it also reflects back to those perceptions or perspectives that we have, and if you grow up in a system, that's the norm, and even if it's not the norm, it's what your perception of it might be, and so it's hard, for us to change our perceptions and accept the fact that maybe that system was an artifact of something that we did to the system.
Sure.
Sea otters are a great example of that.
Yeah. White guy walks into Cordova 100 years ago and he got all these clams everywhere. Oh, great. And they figure that's normal.
Right.
But the only reason it was normal is because 100 years before, or 50 years before that, the Russians took out all the sea otters.
Right.
Yeah, I was just thinking, the Dennis, what's his name, that's his, one of his hypotheses, Dennis.
Dennis Leeds.
Dennis
Yeah,
Leeds,
yeah.
But I was just thinking about the sea otters moving into here in 78, 79, because everybody says, okay, they are the ones that wiped out the Dungees. And then they went on and ate a bunch of surf clams, and the razor clams were already kind of on the down.
From the earthquake.
Well, from the earthquake, and before that, just over
Just
harvested too.
over-harvest.
But, so here they haven't had that urchin food base.
But I've also heard that people could go scuba diving and get king crab all the time in Prince Williams now. Even in Whittier, you could harvest king
So you
crab in
have the
Whittier.
crabs here, I guess,
Yeah.
instead of the.
Yeah, I don't know if urchins were ever abundant. I don't know. I don't know if there was ever a fishery. There was a fishery in Calumet Bay. There was a fishery in Kodiak for urchins. And there's still in places in Kodiak where otters are absent. There's still large populations of urchins in those places.
Right after the spill, we had a little scuba dive thing in Ketchikan Bay at the Consistent Bay Lab, and Rick Rosenthal was on the group. And he had worked in Prince William Sound, some couple decades earlier with Steve Jewett. And we were collecting urchins, the little green urchins, and he was stunned by how small they were.
Yeah.
And he said, this is like completely different from what it used to be. And he noticed, just looked at it, and whoa, it struck him.
Yeah.
But did he remember that there were a lot in Prince William Sound?
Much bigger ones, because they get, roebuck ensigns get harvested as soon as they're more than a quarter size.
And I was up in Port Wells in the 80s, and there were large populations of large urchins in Port Wells at that time. They're not there now. But just,
When is your sampling season? Is it year-round?
it's restricted primarily to 2 seasons. There's a winter season, which we primarily only do the bird and mammal surveys, and that's primarily because of the change in the species composition of birds, to a lesser extent the mammals. But most of the other sampling takes place in the summer season, and it takes place over about a 2-month period.
It might be interesting to see what would happen in the winter. Some of the.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're actually thinking about it. One of the problems with the design is that most of these sites we're only able to access once a year, because of logistics, getting out to the Katmai Coast, some of these locations are fairly remote. And so what we'd like to do is establish a small number of sites that are more readily accessible, that we might be able to access regularly, daily or weekly or periodically through the year, that we can begin to answer some of the questions that are arising because of the infrequency of our sampling at this point. So we're going to try to put that into the sampling in the next few years.
I think anecdotally, the kelp beds in the Sound have really grown a lot in the past 30 years. You just see so many more kelp beds, and they're in turn probably because there's more otters and fewer urchins. And it's all that steep, rocky shoreline area, not the movable sand and mud around here. You'll have to sometime try to get to Simpson or the head of Sheep Bay. I don't know if that one email got to you, but I've been seeing this occurrence that's happening more over the last few years of the sea otters catching and eating the live pink salmon.
Oh, right, I did see that.
Yeah.
I did see that, Dave. I saw the email.
Yeah, it was pretty, both the numbers of otters showing up and learning this behavior.
Yeah.
And the numbers.
Adult pink salmon?
Yeah, it's really pretty amazing.
And they're in their spawning condition, or they are spawning?
They're coming into spawn in
Yeah.
that outer lagoon before that reversing river in there and grab, and then there must be 50 of them inside that lake lagoon inside there.
Yeah.
But it's pretty interesting.
I
It'd
always
be
wondered
interesting
why
to
they
see
didn't
how
take
that
advantage
learning
of
that 100 will get to that 100th otter.
Yeah.
100th monkey. And you'll see the pinks that otters eating the pinks, which is fine. There seems to be plenty of pinks around.
You didn't talk much about sea stars, but what is their role? I mean, are they a keystone species?
Well, certainly, there's been a great deal of work that looks at the, and in fact, that one image that you saw, there were sea stars lined up, and they basically regulate the distribution of mussels. That's one of their primary prey in the rocky habitats, and there's really great work been done looking at the effects of sea star predation on mussels in particular.
There are Pyzaster in this area. I mean, the rock that's right outside of the harbor area has them.
Mm-hmm.
So you've probably seen them, right, around the Sound.
Yeah, sure. And yeah.
Washington State, of course, they're like real thick
Yeah.
on the outer coast,
Right.
but there's still some here.
Yep. And so, there's over 250 species that we're collecting data on. And I only mentioned a few of those here today. So, mostly those that you would recognize. And in fact, many of the kelps I don't recognize. We have, there's, we have a very the taxonomically specific sampling protocol. We have algologists that are doing the sampling, and that are training the young people to.
Mandy
do that
discovered
sampling.
a couple new species.
Yeah.
Out of the oceans.
Right. So, you had a question.
Well, actually, Dave will probably know this answer better than I'm suggesting, but it seems to us that we've seen a lot more sea otters up in the northern part of the Sound, and if there is a large population, is it generally food driven? And we were thinking it might be weather driven, but I don't know if you've even seen this. That there were
The numbers up there are incredible.
In Unaquik
and they seem to just lay around and don't do anything all day
Waiting for the
long.
salmon.
But they're in 1,000 feet of water.
Yeah.
I just don't get those guys. I mean, are they eating a fish
No.
at night when they come up shallow, or do they really go in?
They're going
Inshore
to feed
at
out
night
for those
and then-
moraines.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
And
Boy,
they
sure lay
drift
around
back and
all
forth.
day
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
Summer daylight too. You just don't see them doing anything.
Yeah.
And there's been a big shift of them too. You always used to see them away from the glaciers, and then all of a sudden you'd see a few in Unaquik figuring out, oh, these icebergs are cool. And that was the only place I'd see sea otters on ice. And then it took a while, and all of a sudden it was College Fjord and Harriman got real busy, but it was always the otters off and the seals at the face. And now the seals, they're actually going up to the face of the glacier, getting up on icebergs, sometimes the same iceberg as the seal, the otters.
Yeah.
And it's just the change
That's
in
a
numbers
change.
and movements, and that short of time,
Huh.
25
So
years.
learned behavior.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned twice sea otters learn behavior. Does that mean they teach? Are they teaching generations, or are they teaching other sea otters who are their cubs?
No, it's almost all of the teaching takes place by the female, the mother, and that's really the only tight bond that the species has for any period of time. You know, the male and the female will have a tight bond, but it's going to be fairly short-lived. But the female and her pup, she's with her pup for 6 months, so, and she's dependent, and the pup will likely have a similar diet to the mom. And what we've seen, particularly in places that have a high diversity in diet, where a lot of different things are being eaten, it's not that everybody is eating different things, it's that you're eating something different, and you're eating something different, and you're eating something different. And when we look at it at the population level, it looks like, you know, that everybody is, that the population is consuming a diverse diet, but when in fact, just you're having a very specific diet, and that's because you were trained or taught, you know, how to feed on a specific prey item. Because each of these prey items have a different type of kind of predatory strategy in order to get it. If you're going to dig clams, you know, you have to be able to excavate huge amounts of sediments, and you do it with these 2 paws. If you're going to feed on abalone, then you have to learn how to get this abalone out of these crevices that are very, you know, they're very small crevices, very tight, and this is the only place where that animal lives. And if you're going to hunt crabs, you have to learn where the crabs live and how to hunt those crabs. You have to be an active forager that swims along the bottom and encounters a crab and learns how to, you know, grab that crab, bring it to the surface, and eat it. So they all take kind of different types of foraging strategies and skills, and those skills are basically passed on from mother to offspring.
But then how do then you mentioned earlier about the salmon, the more of them are coming to have the salmon.
Yeah.
So would that be copying, or just simultaneous?
Yeah.
Taking advantage of the situation.
Right. You know, opportunistic, perhaps.
They don't communicate among adults, do they?
Yeah, they do. They do. You get close to a group of sea otters, and if they don't know you're there, and it's quiet and it's calm, you know, you can hear them vocalizing nearly constantly, and it's a very subtle sound. It's a cooing, you know, and you know, it's communication.
So they could possibly call each other to a source.
Yeah, possibly. Or they could communicate, you know, back at that group. We come in and, geez, Dave, you know, guess what I found to eat today?
Yeah.
And, hey, where'd you find that? I
I
don't
smell
know.
salmon on your breath. Where did that come from? You know, I want to come with you. What is that like? And it seemed like it was just one otter for a number of years, and I think it was just happenstance. A few more happened to stumble on it and see it. And I mean, years ago, I used to see pulled up carcasses, like Tom mentioned, in Valdez.
They always see them dragging these big halibut around.
But yeah,
Oh, the carcasses.
the carcasses, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But this live stuff has just really taken off last
Yeah.
year. If you ever get a chance, it's a magical place to begin with, you know,
Yeah.
without that going on. But,
I can tell you a story about down in Glacier Bay. We were working at Cross Sound, which is about not very far, 30 miles or so from Glacier Bay. Otters had been out at Cross Sound for several decades, and they had just moved into Glacier Bay. And we were marking some animals out at Cross Sound, and we found that these females that were having pups out at Cross Sound were taking their pups to Glacier Bay and weaning their pups there, and then returning to Cross Sound. So they were basically taking their pups to places where food was abundant. And when we looked at it more carefully, and calculated the growth rate of sea otters in Glacier Bay, almost every pup that was born within about 50 miles of Glacier Bay was being brought to Glacier Bay. They ended up there, one way or another. Now, they either their mothers took them there, or they were communicating with one another somehow, but they all ended up in Glacier Bay. It's the only explanation for the 50% growth rate that we were seeing in this area.
Like Jonah Bay and in that area.
Every
it
single
seems-
thing we saw was a female with a pup.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and because they have real high energy intake rates, those pups survive. And so we end up with growth rates in the population that are, 25% a year, which is about as, as fast as that population, as that species can grow, given that they only give birth to a single pup and they only give birth once a year. They can't grow much faster than about that.
But then coming 50 miles to bring them up.
Right, so it looks like the population is growing at a huge rate, but it's not, it's a matter of movements, not reproduction. I mean, it's cumulative reproduction over a larger area that's concentrating in a very small area.
Do the pups stay, or do the pups go back to the?
No, the pups will stay in those new areas. But again, this goes back to our discussion a little bit earlier about the system. So sea otters didn't adapt or evolve in a system that had huge amounts of unoccupied habitat that they could disperse to. They evolved in a system where all the habitat was most of the time filled up with sea otters, and you had to compete in an area to find a place to live if you were going to survive. Now there may have been periods of time when populations were reduced for some other reason, some kind of catastrophe, earthquakes possibly, or volcanic action, could probably wipe out large numbers of sea otters. But over at least our understanding of historic time, these populations were relatively stable, and we do see fluctuations over in middens of the abundance of otters over time, which could mean that those populations were fluctuating, and so that when conditions were right, there may have been available habitat for juveniles to have high survival rates in and increase their populations. But the situation where we eliminated, we took sea otters out of 99% of their habitat, that's probably a fairly rare circumstance. And so this situation of, having Orca Inlet hasn't been occupied by sea otters for 100 years, and has repeated itself up and down the coast, those prey populations had a long time to expand and grow and become large and support those high survival rates and those high population growth rates. I'm only speculating when I say that I don't think that was a common situation historically. It could have been, who knows. It's also possible that, that other factors were contributing to mortalities. It was highly variable over time and created areas. But what we do see in places where sea otters occur and have been at a stable density for many decades is that the juveniles are relegated to the suboptimal habitat, and particularly the males. And they have to live there, try to make a living there, before they're kind of have the capacity to compete for a space, within the main body of the population. With juvenile females, one of the things we don't know much about is the dispersal capabilities, particularly of juvenile female sea otters, and how they find a way into the populations. And we also don't know what mechanisms regulate the density of sea otters, because we do see a fairly stable density of animals and populations, at least over the decadal time scales that we've looked at in many places. So, what are the mechanisms? Why don't the populations kind of increase? And probably because there's not enough food, and it's probably because the juveniles are not able to have enough energy to survive. But those mechanisms of how females do find their way back into the population when it is at carrying capacity is something we don't know much about.
Well, you've got me wondering, because here they came in at 78, and that 2003 survey you all did had such high densities, like we were talking about tonight. So I wonder if it's heading down now, that we peaked out because they didn't eat out all, you know what I mean? But I wonder if we could do a survey tomorrow.
Well, right. So in the case here, there was unoccupied habitat, and there still is. Along the outer coast, all the way down to down to southeast Alaska, almost. There's relatively low densities of sea otters, and there's an offshore bank down off of south of Yakutat, actually almost all the way down off Cape Spencer. It's called Sea Otter Bank, and it's tens of kilometers offshore. And I read some historical accounts from native folks that they used to go out there and hunt sea otters out there. So there are habitats that remain unoccupied, and as long as there's kind of adjacent unoccupied habitat, then these animals are capable of kind of recolonizing that and moving. And that's been the pattern that we've seen in recolonization. That they'll kind of build up to a high density, they'll reduce the availability of food, and then they'll move on. And a relatively low density will remain behind.
Are there any demographic effects, like baby boomers in human population, where, you know, if the number of juveniles is suddenly not being produced as much, you're going to start seeing kind of an uneven distribution of age, and maybe you'll have old sea otters all dying, and then all of a sudden there's room for a bunch of juveniles.
Yeah. You know, one of the real great things about the Exxon Valdez oil spill was that we got a population that we assumed, we got a sample of the age class of a population of somewhere around, I think it was about 600 or 700 animals that we actually, aged, and we had, so then we had a picture of what this kind of the age distribution of a population that we assumed to be at or near carrying capacity was like. Unfortunately, that's, it's the only data set that we have of that nature. All of the other data sets on age distribution come from either animals that have been captured for science or animals that have been killed for pelts. Or animals that have died naturally on the beaches, and of course those are all biased samples.
Right. So there's no easy way of aging an otter, I guess.
Yeah, not without its tooth.
Okay. You can't look at the gray fur doesn't give you any kind of
Grizzling is let's see, almost all grizzled animals will be old, but not all old animals will be grizzled.
Okay.
It's like people, I'm 45. I'm 45. I'm not doing the
It's not the years, they got some mileage.
Just wondering about the Aleutian population and what the current thinking about the decline there, if that's still declining, or?
It's there was just a survey out there this year, and the observations of the people that did the survey was that there's not any signs of a wholesale decline continuing or any wholesale increases. There were a few spots that they noticed, perhaps some more animals, but the decline appears to be, or the abundance has appeared to reach a very low level, and is apparently stable at that level now. And it's been there for going on, gosh, almost 15 to 20 years now. So, yeah, there hasn't been much change and much evidence of any recovery.
And is that still presumed to be orca driven, or is that?
Yeah. I mean, there's been controversy over that, but there hasn't been any viable alternatives advanced, or any alternatives that are consistent with the data that we have. And we have a lot of data. We have data that goes back through Carl Kenyon's work in the 1950s at Amchitka, and we've had a presence out there on and off since then. So
Well, it's been observed a fair amount now.
well, it's been observed. It's definitely been observed. On the other hand, it has been observed as often in Prince William Sound as it has been in the Aleutians.
Oh, really?
But there's a lot more observers in Prince William Sound than there are in the Aleutians, of course. But the kind of the convincing evidence in my mind was when I went out there in the early 2000s. We went out there to catch sea otters, and I've caught sea otters my whole career, and from Russia to California, and invariably when you go to catch a sea otter and you don't catch it with those traps, if it sees you first, it dives, and it dives and swims away. And when we were out in the Aleutians, those animals that we attempted to catch her, but we missed, they got out of the water. They left the water. And they only occurred in water that was within a few feet of a place they could escape from. So So their escape was not in the water, their escape was to leave the water, which convinced me that it was a marine predator that was causing it. People have advocated for sharks potentially, and I don't know, it could be sharks, could be aliens. It could be in fact.
But there's no land predators, I guess.
No, there aren't no land predators.
And did the orcas there specialize the way they do in some other populations between mammals and fish? And-
Yes. Yeah. Right. There's kind of almost two different types of orcas, those that eat fish and those that eat mammals. And
Does the otter have much susceptibility to these algae blooms we hear about, like BSP or birds? Say,
Or-
also
yeah.
like oyster catchers, because I see the majority of their food are grazers, and they have a lot of mussels too, but
yeah,
um,
I think the answer is possibly.
uh,
These harmful algal blooms?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I think there's some thought right now that there's been some blooms this past summer in Cook Inlet and Ketchimak Bay, and
Yeah.
that there was a fairly high rate of mortality and morbidity in sea otters in Ketchimak Bay. And that it might have been attributable to that. I think the juries are still out, they're doing the chemistry on that now to determine it, but yeah, I think it's quite possible that they could have an adverse effect.
But PSP, because I was just looking into that, it's never been recorded in Prince William Sound, supposedly. I mean, according to Ray Laurent,
Oh, yeah.
because they do a lot of testing for
Yeah,
it, the oyster
yeah.
farms and stuff. So
Right.
Southeast has had it,
Yeah.
Kodiak has had it.
It shows up in Sand Point saying that there were areas around there that they don't test it regularly, but they were doing a study last summer.
Mm.
But Hagiar was closed down for Jim Hagiar.
Right here for PSP?
I think so.
When was
Couple-
that?
Couple years ago.
There's a bacteria thing that shut it, that and Eaglet,
Okay, but it wasn't
pristine
PSP.
products, I don't think it,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know, this is what Ray said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's other organisms though that that are comprising these harmful algal blooms.
Mhm.
There's a certain diatom.
There's diatoms and there's microcystin was another one that they've had in California. It was coming out of freshwater and it was causing mortality. So
And is there any consensus on what's going with the sea star wasting?
no, I have not kept up with it.
No, okay.
I know that.
Yeah, but-
Yeah, we've been looking for it at the sites, and we have not seen strong evidence of it. I understand
Saw
there's
that
been a
Green
few
Island this
reports.
summer.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it may have been that report that I was referring to. To be honest, I've been looking in Washington, in British Columbia, and have seen examples of the disease in the wild. But it's a range. There's a gradient from animals that are clearly, sick and dying, and others that, well, maybe that one doesn't look very good. And so,
And it's not like it
It's
hasn't been
qualitative
here before,
observation.
from what I
Right,
understand.
right.
It has cycled in
Right,
the past,
right.
this wasting.
And what I've heard from the Seattle Aquarium folks that have been doing some virology is that they're pointing at a virus.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I really haven't followed it closely.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for your interest. It's been a great audience.
Somebody wants to go home.